It was a time when humanity had reached the peak of its technological prowess. Space stations orbited distant moons and colonies on Mars had begun to thrive. Earth's resources, once strained, had been restored through advancements in energy production and sustainable farming technologies. The human race had long ago conquered hunger, disease, and poverty. It seemed that nothing could stand in the way of its dominance in the universe. But the peace was fragile, and as with all things, it was destined to be shattered. The first warning came in the form of strange signals. At first, they were dismissed as cosmic background noise, a natural phenomenon too faint to warrant much concern. But Dr. Alan Wells, an astrophysicist at the prestigious Earth Federation Institute, was the first to notice a disturbing pattern. The signals were too precise, too structured. They weren't random. They were deliberate. In the beginning, the signals were weak, almost imperceptible, but they steadily grew in strength. Dr. Wells dedicated his life to deciphering the message. What he uncovered would change the fate of Earth forever. The signals came from deep space, a region of the galaxy thought to be uninhabitable, a place where the laws of physics seemed to bend and twist in ways unimaginable. The message wasn't a call for help, nor was it a plea for trade or diplomacy. It was a warning, a threat. The alien species that sent the signals were ancient, technologically advanced, and seemingly invincible. Their civilization had flourished for eons, and now they were setting their sights on Earth. Their race, known as the Vrath, had eradicated countless other civilizations across the galaxy, leaving behind only desolate worlds and lifeless stars. The Vrath were coming, and Earth was their next target. The world's leaders were thrown into chaos. The United Earth Council convened in an emergency session, but despite their technological supremacy, they had no answer to the threat. Earth's military forces, though advanced, were no match for the Vrath's power. Their ships, capable of decimating entire fleets with a single shot, were unlike anything humanity had ever seen. There was no place to hide. No defense strong enough to repel the oncoming storm. Fear swept across the planet, but amidst the growing panic, one voice stood above the rest. Dr. Wells, having spent weeks poring over the alien signals, realized something crucial. The Vrath's power wasn't simply in their weaponry or ships, it was in their energy sources. The Vrath had mastered the manipulation of quantum energy, harnessing forces that humanity had only begun to understand. But there was a flaw, a chink in their armor. Dr. Wells theorized that if humanity could develop a similar technology, they could level the playing field and perhaps even gain the upper hand. With no time to lose, the world's best minds were called into action. The race against time began. The idea of using quantum energy to power a new form of weaponry, a weapon that could challenge the Vrath, was born. But there was a problem. The technology was still in its infancy. Earth's greatest minds could barely understand the principles of quantum energy, let alone harness it on such a grand scale. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. Humanity's survival depended on one thing, the creation of a weapon that could match the Vrath's power. Scientists, engineers, and strategists worked around the clock. The world's brightest minds came together, pooling their knowledge and resources to forge a plan. Earth's greatest technological marvel was about to be born. The project was codenamed Helios, after the ancient Greek god of the sun, for the energy harnessed would rival the very stars. It was a weapon but also a shield, capable of turning the tide of battle in an instant. The Helios project was humanity's last hope. But as the project neared its completion, the first Vrath ships arrived at the edges of the solar system. Their presence was a signal, Earth's time was running out. The people of Earth held their breath, waiting for the inevitable. Would humanity's greatest technological achievement be enough to turn the tide, or would they fall to the same fate as countless civilizations before them? The answer, however, lay not only in the technology they had created but in the resilience and determination of the human spirit. In the quiet corners of Earth's labs, among the hum of machines and the frantic clatter of keyboards, one thing was clear. Humanity had only one choice: to rise from the ashes of destruction and prove that they were more than just survivors. They were conquerors. And so, the stage was set for the greatest battle in the history of the human race. A battle that would determine not only the fate of Earth but the legacy of humanity itself. As the Vrath fleet loomed ever closer, Earth's defenses seemed hopelessly inadequate. Humanity's greatest technological marvel, Helios, was humanity's last hope, yet it was still in its final stages of development. Only a handful of prototypes had been tested, and the full potential of the quantum energy harnessed within the system had yet to be realized. The United Earth Council placed its faith in the hands of a small but brilliant team of scientists, engineers, and military leaders. The team was led by Dr. Alan Wells, whose tireless work had brought them this far. But there was a problem. While Helios held immense potential, its sheer power was volatile, difficult to control. One mistake could cause catastrophic failure. In an underground lab in New Mexico, the final stage of development was underway. The Helios device, now a towering, monolithic structure, pulsed with energy. Its core, a swirling mass of controlled quantum fields, hummed softly as if it were alive. Nearby, engineers calibrated the system, their faces a mixture of determination and nervous anticipation. The weapon was ready, but only in theory. "Are you sure this is going to work?" General Katia Rains, commander of the Earth Defense Fleet, asked, her voice tinged with doubt. Dr. Wells turned, his usually composed expression strained. "We've made every calculation. If it works as we expect, Helios will have the power to disrupt their quantum shields, rendering their weapons useless. But we won't know for sure until we fire it." Rains nodded. The Vrath fleet was now only hours away, and time was no longer a luxury. "I don't care what happens," she said, her voice steady. "We fire it. We fight back." With little choice, the launch sequence began. The countdown echoed throughout the bunker as technicians raced to ensure that every detail was perfect. The entire world watched through live feeds, anxiously awaiting the moment when humanity's survival would either be secured or doomed. As the final seconds ticked away, a quiet, tense anticipation filled the air. Dr. Wells entered the control room, his hands hovering over the final sequence on the holographic console. The world held its breath. 3, 2, 1, he muttered, tapping the final command. The Helios core ignited. The entire lab trembled as the power of the quantum energy surged into the weapon, sending out a pulse that rippled through the atmosphere. The energy wave shot skyward, the immense power of it visible to everyone on Earth, like a second sun rising in the sky. Above, in space, the Vrath fleet felt the impact. Their advanced quantum shields began to flicker, struggling against the disruptive wave. A series of violent pulses shot through the Vrath ships, their energy systems overloading. The Vrath were not accustomed to anything like this. Their technology was ancient, nearly perfect, but they had never faced an adversary capable of wielding such an unpredictable force. As the pulse washed over the alien ships, their once impenetrable shields failed. The fleet, caught off guard, faltered. "Direct hit," shouted one of the engineers. "We've disabled their shields. They're vulnerable." The Helios device had worked. Humanity had successfully created a weapon capable of challenging the Vratha's overwhelming power. But this victory was bittersweet. The Vrath weren't simply going to retreat, they had only just begun their assault. The Vrath retaliated swiftly, sending a wave of energy blasts at Earth's atmosphere. The sky above the planet turned dark as the Vrath prepared to unleash their full fury. A devastating counterstrike was incoming. Rains was already on the comms, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Prepare for battle, all fleets, engage the Vrath. We have them on the ropes." But as the battle between Earth's forces and the Vrath intensified, a new threat emerged. In the midst of the fighting, something strange began to happen. Small, almost imperceptible breaches were appearing in the very fabric of space. Quantum distortions, far beyond the capability of any technology humanity had created, were beginning to tear at the fabric of reality itself. "What the hell is happening?" Rains demanded, her voice rising with concern. Dr. Wells, standing by a bank of monitors, felt his blood run cold. He quickly ran a diagnostic, then turned back to face the room. "The Helios pulse, it's destabilizing the quantum field. It's not just disrupting their shields, it's opening a rift. A tear in the very space-time continuum." The Vrath, it seemed, had not only mastered advanced technology, they had mastered the manipulation of dimensional boundaries. Their ships were more than just weapons, they were vessels that operated at the edges of reality itself. "Contain it," Dr. Wells shouted, his voice rising in panic. "If this rift opens fully, it could consume Earth. We have to stabilize it." But it was too late. The rift continued to widen, pulling at the surrounding space and with it, the very future of humanity. The battle, it seemed, was no longer just for survival against the Vrath, it was for the very existence of the universe. And all the while, the Vrath watched, their cold, calculating eyes observing Earth's desperate struggle. Their victory was no longer a matter of if, but when. Humanity, standing at the edge of oblivion, now had to face a new enemy, reality itself. As the quantum rift spread, its pull began to warp reality itself. What had started as a simple disruption to the Vratha's shields had spiraled into something far more dangerous. The rift, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light, was not only destabilizing Earth's energy grid, it was destabilizing the fabric of spacetime itself. The sky seemed to shimmer and twist, as though the very atmosphere were being torn apart at the seams. Dr. Alan Wells stood before the massive holographic displays, his eyes darting between the chaotic data pouring in from all sides. The feedback loop caused by Helios was worse than he had feared. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a doorway, a crack in the universe itself, a potential breach between dimensions. "We have to shut it down," Dr. Wells muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked around the room at the gathered experts, all of them tense with fear. "We can't let it grow any larger. If the rift stabilizes, it could pull us into a void, or worse, it could unleash something from the other side." General Katia Rains stood at the command console, her brow furrowed in thought. "If we shut it down, will it stop the Vrath attack?" "I don't know," Dr. Wells admitted, his voice strained with frustration. "But if we don't, the consequences could be far worse than losing the war. The rift is opening in ways that we don't understand, there's no telling what could come through it." Despite the growing uncertainty, Rains remained resolute. "Then we fight on two fronts. We need Helios to be the key to defeating the Vrath, but we need to contain this rift first. Can we isolate it?" Wells shook his head. "We don't have the technology to control this. We barely understand it. What we need is a way to stabilize the rift long enough to disable the quantum field around it. It's going to take all of humanity's collective might." The Earth Defense Fleet's ships continued to engage the Vrath forces, their energy weapons flashing against the alien hulls. The Vrath were relentless, their ships weaving through the battlefield with terrifying precision, each blast of their weapons cutting through Earth's defensive lines like a hot knife through butter. But the shift in battle dynamics had given humanity a small window of opportunity. As the Helios device continued to pulse, small disruptions rippled through the Vrath fleet. The shields, though weakened, were still holding, and it wasn't enough. Humanity had a weapon, but it lacked the ability to truly harness its power and use it to its full advantage. The rift, meanwhile, was growing larger, a swirling vortex that seemed to stretch into infinity. The edges flickered like a fractured mirror, revealing strange, alien landscapes within. It wasn't just pulling at the atmosphere, it was starting to affect time itself. Soldiers on Earth's ships reported odd anomalies, weapons firing at half their speed, clocks running faster or slower, and gravity shifting in strange, localized pockets. The Vrath ships were just as affected, though not in the same way. "General, we can't hold them off much longer," shouted Admiral Leon Novak, his voice urgent. "The Vrath are pushing through our defenses, they're overwhelming us." Rains grimaced but didn't falter. "We can't retreat now. Get the remaining fleet to focus fire on the Vratha's command ships. We need to buy time to stabilize this rift." But just as the order was given, something unexpected happened. A massive distortion in the rift, much larger than before, suddenly expanded. From the swirling abyss, shapes began to materialize, dark and menacing. They were not Vrath ships, nor anything Earth had encountered before. They were colossal, black creatures, their bodies made of shifting, liquid-like darkness, like shadows given form. Their eyes burned with an unnatural red glow as they emerged from the rift. Each one was the size of a city, their forms shifting and twisting unnaturally as they began to drift into the atmosphere. "They're coming through?" Rains shouted. "We need to act now." Dr. Wells paled. "Those aren't from the Vrath. These are something far older, something beyond anything we've ever faced." The creatures, massive and terrifying, began descending toward Earth, their movements slow but inexorable. The gravitational pull of the rift had begun to tear at the planet itself. Every passing moment stretched time, causing further distortions. As the dark entities reached the surface, the Earth trembled beneath them. They began to destroy everything in their path, unleashing an oppressive energy that seemed to drain the very life force from anything nearby. As the rift continued to expand, Earth's defenses faltered. The Vrath, witnessing the emergence of these unknown entities, hesitated for a moment. The battle had become something far more complicated. Now Earth had to fight not only the Vrath but the monstrous eldritch creatures spilling forth from the rift, a dark force that threatened to unravel the very universe. Desperation set in. The Helios pulse had backfired. No longer a beacon of hope, it had opened the gateway to a force beyond their understanding. "We need to close the rift," Dr. Wells said, his voice grim. "There's no choice. The Helios device is our only chance, but we need to stabilize it before these things tear our world apart." Rains turned to her team. "Prepare the fleet for a last stand. If we don't stop these creatures, we're lost. If we don't stop the Vrath, we're lost. It's all or nothing. The battle had shifted. It was no longer just a fight for Earth's survival. Now, the fate of all of existence hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of the rift that had been opened. And the monsters from the dark void had just begun to awaken. The dark creatures, beasts that defied natural law, ripped through Earth's defenses like paper. Their massive forms shimmered in and out of existence, their bodies pulsating with an energy that bent the world around them. The very air seemed to bend, as though the fabric of reality itself was warping to accommodate their presence. Some of the creatures slithered across the landscape, their enormous, twisting limbs leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Others soared into the sky, their black wings blotting out the sun as they descended upon Earth's cities. The ground beneath their feet trembled as if the planet itself were dying, every step of these shadowy beings sending tremors that shook entire continents. The air crackled with a charged alien energy as the creatures lashed out, tearing apart anything that came within their reach. Meanwhile, Earth's remaining fleets continued to fight the Wrath, though the odds had shifted dramatically. The Wrath, momentarily stunned by the appearance of these new enemies, quickly adapted to the chaos and began targeting the creatures, but it was clear the battle had become more complex than anyone had imagined. General Katia Rains stood on the command bridge of the flagship Elysium, her mind racing. She watched the tactical screens, each one showing the unimaginable. Earth's defense fleet was now engaged on 3 fronts. The Wrath still pushed forward, though they were slowed by the rift and the newly arrived creatures, but humanity's forces were overwhelmed, outnumbered, and under-equipped for a war on this scale. She gripped the edge of the console tightly, her knuckles turning white. We need to stabilize that rift. Now. Dr. Wells, still in the underground lab monitoring the situation, stood next to the nearly finished Helios device, his expression grim. The core was unstable, its energy reaching levels they hadn't anticipated. Despite their best efforts, they had not been able to contain the rift. The pulse from the Helios had fractured spacetime in ways that no one fully understood, and now there was no going back. The rift was growing uncontrollably. The screen in front of Wells blinked to life, showing images of the rift, its edges rippling like water, as though an invisible hand were stretching and pulling it in every direction. Beyond its depths, strange flashes of light hinted at even darker things. Things far worse than the Wrath, far worse than the creatures now ravaging Earth. "There's no more time," Wells muttered under his breath, his mind trying to calculate the impossible. He knew what he had to do, but the risks were unimaginable. If the Helios device was fired again in its current state, it might either collapse the rift or widen it beyond anything that could be controlled. A voice echoed over the comms. "Dr. Wells, we need you in the command room. We have no other option." It was Rains. Her voice was calm, but the tension was unmistakable. "I'm on my way," Wells replied, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. He had spent years studying quantum energy, yet this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He wasn't just fighting an enemy, he was struggling against the fundamental laws of the universe. The moment Dr. Wells arrived on the bridge, Rains wasted no time. "What are our options?" "We have one," he said, stepping up to the hollow table. "But it's a gamble. The Helios core as it is unstable. If we fire it again, it could either close the rift, or make it permanent, destabilizing Earth's entire dimensional space." "And if we do nothing?" Rains asked. "We die," Wells said flatly. "We lose everything." The tension on the bridge was suffocating. Everyone knew they were out of time. Just then the ship's sensors began blaring. Another massive wave of Wrath ships was arriving, this time with reinforcements. The first wave had faltered, but the Wrath were not a race to back down from a challenge. Their reinforcements were massive, each ship carrying enough firepower to decimate what was left of Earth's fleet. "General, we need to move now," shouted Admiral Novak, his voice laced with urgency. Rains nodded. "Prepare the Helios for activation." Wells hesitated, his hands hovering over the console. He had seen what the Helios could do, he had seen its power. But now, that power was something far more dangerous. He could feel the weight of his decision. If this didn't work, humanity would be lost. If it did work, there was a chance, a fragile, slim chance, that they could not only stop the Wrath but also close the rift and save Earth. "All right," Wells said, steeling himself. "Let's do this." He tapped the activation button. For a moment nothing happened. The bridge was silent, everyone holding their breath. Then, with a roar of energy, the Helios core surged to life. A blinding flash of light erupted from the device, its pulse rippling outward like a shockwave. The entire ship trembled from the force of it. Above Earth, in the heart of the rift, the alien creatures shrieked in agony as the pulse struck them. Their bodies convulsed, twisting and distorting as though they were being torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. The rift itself flickered violently, its swirling edges beginning to shrink, collapsing in on itself. But the Vrath weren't idle. Their ships fired, missiles and energy beams shooting toward the Helios device in the fleet. The battle intensified, and Earth's last hope was held in the hands of this one weapon. "This is it," Novak shouted. "The rift is collapsing." As the Helios pulse continued to press forward, the air shimmered once again. Time seemed to stretch and bend, but Earth's forces held their ground, rallying as the very fabric of space began to mend. The creatures from the rift screeched and writhed, their forms finally losing their grip on reality. One by one they collapsed into nothingness, sucked back into the collapsing rift. The Vrath, seeing the rift destabilize, began to retreat, unsure of what had just transpired. The creature army was crumbling. But their retreat was not without loss. Massive swaths of their fleet were disabled as the last remnants of the rift's chaos continued to spread. The Helios had succeeded. The rift was collapsing. The creatures were gone. But Earth had paid a terrible price. The rift had been sealed, the Vrath were in retreat, but at what cost? As Dr. Wells looked out from the bridge's viewport, he saw the damage. Cities decimated, a fractured world hanging in the balance. They had won, but the road ahead would be a long and painful one. Humanity had survived, but the real challenge was only just beginning. The blinding flash of the Helios pulse faded, and the darkness that had threatened to swallow Earth began to dissipate. For a fleeting moment, there was silence, a collective exhale as the rift collapsed, and the monstrous creatures were drawn back into the void from which they came. Earth's defenses had held, and the Vrath retreated, their forces decimated in the wake of the cosmic chaos. But as the dust settled, the full weight of humanity's survival began to sink in. Earth was not the same as it had been before. General Katia Rains stood on the bridge of the Elysium, staring out into the shattered remnants of Earth's once glorious cities. The war, though won, had left scars that would take generations to heal. She could see the crumbled ruins of New York, the once proud skyline of London reduced to a pile of rubble, and vast sections of land scorched by the unleashed power of the Vrath and the eldritch creatures. In the distance, broken ships from Earth's defense fleet drifted aimlessly through the atmosphere, their energy reserves depleted, their hulls torn open by the ferocious battle. Humanity had survived the war, but it had paid a devastating price. The Earth's population had been halved, entire ecosystems had been ravaged, and the infrastructure of the world had been reduced to ruins. The resources needed to rebuild seemed endless, and the wounds inflicted on the planet would take years to heal, if they could heal at all. "We did it," Rains murmured to herself, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ship's systems. "We survived. But at what cost?" Admiral Leon Novak approached her side, his expression grim. "The battle is won, General. But the war isn't over. We're going to need more than Helios to rebuild. We need to find out what caused this. What started it?" Rains nodded, her eyes narrowing as she gazed out at the fractured world. The Vrath were only part of this. They were just the first wave. And now there's something else we don't understand. Something worse. Dr. Alan Wells, who had been working alongside engineers and scientists to stabilize the Helios device, entered the room. His face was drawn, the weight of the events pressing on him. He had spent so many sleepless nights obsessing over the quantum energy that powered the Helios, and now he was beginning to understand the true nature of what they had unleashed. "We're still studying the data, General," Wells said, his voice cold and measured. "But I can tell you this much. The rift wasn't just a tear in space-time, it was a doorway. A doorway to something far older than the Vrath. These creatures, the ones that came through, they weren't just living beings. They were something else. Something that predates even the Vrath. Something that, if we don't understand it, could still threaten us." Rains turned to face him, her expression hardening. "So we haven't won." "Not really." "No," Wells replied. "Not yet. We've pushed them back, but we don't know what's still out there. And the Helios pulse, it wasn't just a weapon. It's a key. We've opened a door and we don't know what else we're going to let in." The room fell silent as the reality of the situation hit them all at once. The Vrath had been a threat, but now there were other forces at play, forces that transcended anything humanity had encountered. If Earth had opened the door to the unknown, who knew what else might come through? "We need answers," Rain said, her voice firm with resolve. "We can't just wait for the next wave to hit. We need to find out what's out there and stop it before it destroys us all." Wells hesitated. "I think we need to go beyond Earth. We need to go to the source of the rift." The room went still. Everyone knew the gravity of what he was suggesting. The source of the rift was unknown, but Wells had begun to theorize that the tear in spacetime had originated from somewhere beyond their galaxy, a place where the rules of physics and reality didn't just bend, but broke entirely. "We don't have the resources for an intergalactic mission," Novak said, his voice skeptical. "And the Vrath are still out there. They may have retreated, but they're not gone. We're still vulnerable." "I understand the risks," Wells replied. "But we need to understand the nature of this rift. If we don't stop whatever is out there, if we don't find the source, we're just delaying the inevitable." Rains took a deep breath, her mind racing with the impossible task ahead of them. They had barely survived the Vrath, and now they were being asked to face an even greater threat. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, she felt the familiar spark of determination. Humanity had always fought for survival. "We have to take that risk," Rain said, her voice unwavering. "We'll prepare an expedition, find the source, and stop whatever's out there before it destroys us." Wells nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and hope. "I'll need a team. And we'll need Helios to stabilize the rift long enough to reach the source. Without it, we'll be facing the unknown with no way to fight back." As plans for the expedition began to take shape, Earth's leaders gathered to discuss their next steps. There was no turning back now. They had to move forward even if it meant venturing into the heart of the unknown. In the meantime, Earth's survivors worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost. The war had left humanity broken, but it had also united them in a way that nothing had before. Nations set aside their differences, pooling resources to revive the planet's ecosystems, restore power, and rebuild cities. It was a long and arduous task, but there was hope. The human spirit, after all, was not easily crushed. But as the days turned to weeks and weeks into months, Earth's leaders knew that the real fight was far from over. The rift had been closed, but it had left something lingering behind. Something ancient and powerful. And if they didn't stop it now, it would be a matter of time before the next invasion, a threat even greater than the Vrath, would make its presence known. Humanity had won its battle for survival. But now they faced the ultimate test, to prevent the destruction of everything they had fought so hard to save. The journey into the unknown had just begun. The expedition to the source of the rift was humanity's final hope. With Earth still healing from the devastating war, General Katia Rains knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The Vrath had been repelled, but the threat from the rift, from what lay beyond it, was still a shadow that hung over them. The creatures they had witnessed, massive ancient beings, were only a taste of the danger that awaited if the rift wasn't fully understood and sealed. In the command center of the Elysium, the fleet's flagship, the preparations were nearly complete. A handful of ships, armed to the teeth and equipped with the best technology Earth had to offer, were being ready to follow the rift's traces back to its origin. The mission was risky, perhaps suicidal. Yet it was their only option. Dr. Alan Wells had been working day and night to refine the Helios device. They had learned from their earlier mistake. They couldn't simply fire it again and hope for the best. The pulse it generated had been necessary, but now Wells theorized they could use its technology to stabilize the rift temporarily, allowing them to send a team through to investigate what lay on the other side. They would need to understand where it led and what, or who, was behind the forces that had tried to destroy Earth. As the mission neared launch, Wells stood in front of a holographic display, adjusting the quantum frequency of Helios for the last time. The device hummed with an eerie low sound that reverberated through the walls of the ship. "You're sure about this, Doctor?" Rain's voice broke through his concentration. She stood at the door to the lab, her eyes narrowed in concern. "I'm sure," Wells said without turning to face her. "It's the only way to trace the origin of the rift. The Helios pulse will provide a stable pathway through the quantum distortion. But we have no idea what we'll find once we get there." Rains crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "And the risks? They're considerable," Wells admitted, his voice softer. "But if we don't go, we'll never truly know what caused this, what opened the rift in the first place. If we don't close it from the source, we'll be playing a dangerous game of waiting." The general didn't flinch. "Then we go. Let's get this over with." With that, the fleet went silent in the minutes before launch. Rains stood at the command center, watching as the ships began to move out of Earth's orbit. The rift, still faintly glowing in the distance, loomed like a dark mark in space. It was the only thing that stood between Earth and total destruction. The plan was simple: deploy a small team of elite soldiers and scientists, equipped with Helios technology, to follow the rift's traces through the quantum tear. The team would be led by Rains herself, Earth's most capable strategist. Alongside her would be Wells, whose knowledge of the Helios device was indispensable, as well as a select group of soldiers and engineers. As the fleet approached the rift, a heavy sense of unease washed over everyone on board. The vastness of space was a stark reminder of how insignificant Earth seemed in the grand scheme of things. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Rains couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Humanity had survived the Wrath and the ancient creatures. They could survive this too. Suddenly, the ship's systems began to flicker, and the hum of the engines grew louder. The rift was pulsing again, but this time it was different. Something inside it had awakened. Wells rushed to the console, tapping in commands frantically. "The rift is destabilizing," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to go now before it's too late." Rains grabbed her communicator. "All ships, prepare to jump through the rift. We have one shot at this." With the fleet now just outside the rift, Rains took a deep breath, staring out at the swirling black hole ahead. For all their technology, for all their advancements, they were about to take a step into the unknown. She knew this was it, the final battle for humanity's survival. They had no choice but to go forward. In the next instant, the ships broke through the rift's barrier. The sensation of traveling through the rift was unlike anything Rains had ever experienced. The laws of physics twisted and stretched as if they were being written in real time, and for a moment, it felt like they were falling not through space but through time itself. The space around them fractured, and she couldn't even be sure if they were still in the same universe. Then, with a violent jolt, the fleet emerged on the other side. What they saw was not what they had expected. The rift had led them to a place far beyond the boundaries of their known galaxy. The void was filled with strange, shifting stars. Some of them pulsed with an unnatural energy, others burned cold and dim like dying embers. Planets hung in the distance, lifeless and decayed. The entire expanse was dark and oppressive, like an ancient tomb. But there was something else. In the distance, a massive structure far larger than anything Earth had ever built floated in space. It was made of dark metal, covered in strange markings that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. It resembled a sprawling city, with massive spires stretching high into the void, an eerie silhouette against the backdrop of dying stars. "This is it," Wells said, his voice a whisper of disbelief. "The source." Rains activated the fleet's communication system, her voice unwavering despite the fear creeping up her spine. "All ships, form up. We're going in." The fleet slowly began to move toward the structure, the dark, towering monolith in the distance growing larger with every passing second. As they neared it, Rains could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on her, but she pushed it aside. They had come this far. They couldn't turn back now. Then suddenly a sound, a low, vibrating hum, broke through the silence. It came from the structure itself, a pulsating energy that reverberated through the fleet. The lights flickered and systems began to malfunction. The ship's hull groaned as if it were being pulled toward the monolith. Something had noticed them. Something ancient. "We've been detected," Wells said, panic rising in his voice. Rains didn't have time to respond. The ships were already within range of the monolith. And then, just as they began to prepare for whatever came next, a massive, glowing energy beam shot from the heart of the structure, striking their lead ship. The Elysium rocked violently, alarms blaring across the fleet. "We're under attack," Novak shouted. But it was too late. The energy beam split the lead ship in two, sending debris spiraling into space. The remaining ships began to return fire, but they were outmatched. The monolith was far more advanced, far more powerful than anything Earth had ever faced. The expedition had taken its first casualty. And this was just the beginning. The Elysium shuddered violently as the monolith's energy beam struck, sending the fleet's flagship spiraling out of control. General Katia Rains gripped the command chair, her mind racing. The Elysium had been torn apart in the blink of an eye, its hull fractured, its systems faltering. Panic rippled through the crew, but Rains didn't allow herself to be consumed by it. If they were to survive, they needed to stay focused. "Status report," she barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. Admiral Leon Novak's voice came over the comms, sharp and calm despite the situation. "We've lost the Elysium's power grid. Shields are down. We've taken major damage, but we're still operational, General. The rest of the fleet is holding off the monolith's defenses." "Hold them off as long as you can," Rains ordered. "We need to regroup, get on the ground, and find a way to neutralize whatever is controlling this place." "Understood," Novak replied before cutting off the transmission. Rains quickly turned to Dr. Alan Wells, who was furiously working at a nearby terminal. His fingers flew over the holographic controls as he tried to re-establish some form of connection to the fleet systems. His face was pale, his expression tense. "We can't fight this thing with conventional weapons, General," Wells said, his voice strained. "We need to find the source of its power, wherever it's coming from. It's not just a structure. It's a living entity. This place, it's been here for eons." "Then we'll have to fight smart," Raines replied, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the vast monolith in the distance. "We'll find its weakness and we'll strike. We need boots on the ground." Wells hesitated, glancing at the monitors. The fleet was engaged in a desperate firefight with the monolith's automated defenses, but the tide of the battle was turning. Earth's ships were powerful, but the monolith was something else entirely: ancient, alien, and seemingly indestructible. "I'll prepare the team for deployment," Raines said, rising from her seat. "Wells, you're with me. We need you to help us find out what's controlling this thing. Everyone else, secure the perimeter. We can't afford to be caught off guard." Hours later, the first wave of Earth's soldiers and scientists made their way toward the surface of the monolith. Raines led the charge, her heart pounding as her boots thudded against the metallic ground. The surface of the monolith was unervingly smooth, almost as if the structure had been designed for the express purpose of hiding its true nature. The very air felt wrong, dense with an energy that made it difficult to breathe. As they approached the monolith's central hub, a vast open space inside the structure, the group began to see what lay hidden within. The interior was far more alien than they could have imagined. Giant, biomechanical columns stretched upward, their surfaces lined with strange symbols that pulsed with light. The walls seemed to move as if the structure itself was alive, breathing. "This place," Wells whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's not just a weapon. It's a temple, a nexus. And it's ancient, far older than the Vrath, older than anything we've encountered. This civilization, whoever built this, wasn't just technologically advanced. They were something else." Raines kept her focus. "What do you mean by something else?" Wells hesitated before answering. "This is more than just technology. This is a mind. A collective intelligence. It's a consciousness. It's been dormant, waiting for something to awaken it. And we did that. When we closed the rift, we triggered it." Raines clenched her jaw. "And now it's coming after us." Before Wells could respond, a rumbling shook the floor beneath them. The columns of the monolith shifted, their lights flickering violently. Something in the heart of the structure began to hum, sending tremors through the entire space. "We're not alone," Raines muttered, reaching for her weapon. "Get ready." From the shadows of the monolith's massive interior, humanoid figures began to emerge, dark, armored beings whose presence radiated an unnatural power. They moved with the precision of machines, but their eyes, bright, glowing with an eerie light, told a different story. They were something living, something sentient. Wells froze. Those aren't just defenders. They're part of the consciousness, part of the system. They're the Guardians. Raines raised her rifle. "Guardians or not, they're standing between us and the heart of this thing. Move out." The soldiers charged forward, engaging the Guardians in a deadly firefight. The weapons that had brought down the Vrath were ineffective against the armored figures, and Earth soldiers quickly realized that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. The Guardians fought with an eerie precision, their movements almost pre-programmed as if they were following some higher directive. As the battle raged, Raines fought her way through the chaos, her eyes locked on the central chamber where Wells had indicated the heart of the structure would be. She knew they had to reach it before the Guardians overwhelmed them. The group pushed forward, taking cover behind massive pillars as the Guardians closed in. Raines ducked behind a column, scanning the room for any sign of weakness. Wells was still with her, his face taut with concentration. "There?" Wells shouted, pointing toward a massive central console embedded in the floor. The symbols around it glowed with an eerie energy. "That's where the consciousness is anchored. If we can disable it, we can sever the connection between this structure and whatever's controlling it." Raines nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. "Then let's end this." But as they approached the console, the ground beneath them began to shake once again. The monolith's interior warped, the walls seemingly bending and shifting. The Guardians moved into a tighter formation, surrounding them, their eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. Raines knew that the final battle for Earth's survival had arrived. It was no longer just about defending the planet, it was about confronting a force far older and more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And if they failed here, humanity wouldn't just lose Earth. They would lose everything. "We have one shot at this," Raines said, gritting her teeth. "Everyone focus fire on the center. Now." As the team fired in unison, the chamber erupted with energy, the entire structure seeming to come alive in retaliation. It was a battle between man and machine, between the last remnants of humanity and a force that had waited millennia for its moment to strike. And in that moment, everything would change. The monolith trembled as the combined firepower of Earth's last stand slammed into its core. Rains could feel the vibrations through the soles of her boots, and she clenched her jaw as the strange alien hum grew louder. Each shot fired seemed to rattle the very fabric of the structure, but nothing stopped the relentless advance of the Guardians. They moved with a calculated ferocity, their glowing eyes unwavering as they continued to press the attack. "This is it," Rains yelled to the team, her voice cutting through the deafening noise of the battle. "We don't back down now." The ground beneath them cracked, and from the fissures, dark tendrils of energy spiraled outward, trying to lash at the humans. They narrowly dodged, their reflexes honed by the war for Earth's survival. But it was clear, every second they delayed, the monolith's defenses grew stronger. Wells, his face ashen with the weight of what they were facing, rushed toward the central console that hummed ominously at the heart of the chamber. He tapped in a series of frantic commands, his hands shaking as they brushed over the symbols etched into the surface. The energy beneath them pulsed and shifted, as if the structure itself was alive and sensing their every move. "The consciousness is awake," Wells said, his voice tight with dread. It's connected to every part of this place. If we destroy this core, we sever its control over the structure, but we'll have to be fast." Rains nodded. "We don't have much time. Cover Wells." The soldiers moved into position, firing on the Guardians who were closing in on them. The warriors were relentless, blocking every attempt to advance. But Rains wouldn't let up. She fired with deadly precision, every shot finding its mark. The air was thick with the smell of ionized air, the sound of gunfire a constant barrage against the monolith's dark organic walls. Finally, Wells reached the console. With a deep breath, he pressed a series of symbols that sent a shockwave of energy throughout the entire room. The monolith shuddered, and for the first time the Guardians faltered. "We've made a breach," Wells shouted, his voice barely audible over the commotion. "The connection is weakening, but we need to trigger the final sequence." Rains didn't hesitate. She launched herself forward, weapon raised, and took cover just as a massive Guardian barreled toward them. She fired a burst of energy that sent it stumbling backward, its glowing eyes flickering as if its systems were faltering. But even as the Guardians weakened, something else began to stir, something far darker than the defenders. From the depths of the monolith came an entity, not a machine but a living presence. A vast, ancient consciousness that filled the space with its presence. It was as though the very air around them thickened, pressing in from all sides. Its voice, low and resonant, filled the chamber, echoing in their minds, a voice that reached across eons. "Foolish beings. You think you can disrupt what has been eternal? I am the Watcher, the first, the keeper of this place. You awaken me from my slumber, and now you will face the consequences." Rains froze for a moment, feeling the weight of the ancient power bearing down on her. She gritted her teeth, fighting against the overwhelming pressure in her mind. The Watcher's words, like a pulse of pure malice, reverberated through her. But she wouldn't let it break her. Humanity had already survived far worse. They would not fall here, not now. "Wells," she shouted. "Do it now. We need that final trigger." With one final push, Wells tapped in the last sequence. There was a loud, deep rumble throughout the entire monolith. A flash of brilliant light erupted from the core of the structure as a burst of energy shot upward. The monolith itself seemed to scream, its outer walls fracturing under the pressure. The Guardians, their power fading, staggered and collapsed, their forms disintegrating into the dark energy that powered them. The Watcher's presence wavered, and for a brief moment, Rains thought they might have won. But then the voice of the Watcher returned, louder, more desperate. "You cannot comprehend the power you have awakened. The rift is but a door, a means to an end. You are nothing but a fleeting moment, a blip in time, and you will be forgotten." In an instant, the entire chamber shifted violently. The monolith's core exploded with light, and a massive shockwave blasted outward. Rains felt the floor beneath her shake and crack. The air, once heavy with oppression, seemed to explode with an intense energy as though the monolith itself was fighting to stay intact. "Wells, get to the ship, now." Rains barked, her voice cracking with urgency. Wells didn't need to be told twice. He turned and sprinted toward the exit, his legs carrying him faster than he thought possible. Rains followed close behind, fighting the urge to look back at the monolith that was collapsing behind them. The moment they reached the docking bay, Rain slammed her hand down on the emergency controls. The ship's engines roared to life, and the crew scrambled to escape the collapsing structure. The last of the ships broke free from the gravity well of the monolith as the entire structure erupted in a final burst of energy, disappearing into the void, leaving only shattered remnants in its wake. The stars were eerily quiet as the fleet drifted in the aftermath. Rain stared out at the vast expanse of space, her chest heavy with the weight of what they had just done. They had survived. But what did it mean? The Watcher was gone, its consciousness scattered across the stars, but its warnings lingered in her mind. Was this truly the end? Or had they simply uncovered the tip of an iceberg far larger than they could have ever anticipated? Dr. Alan Wells, exhausted but resolute, approached her. His face was pale, but there was a glimmer of something, hope, maybe, in his eyes. "We did it," he said quietly. "The rift's been sealed." But, he trailed off, looking toward the vast unknown. "I think the real battle is just beginning." Rains nodded slowly, her gaze still fixed on the stars. "We'll be ready. Humanity isn't finished. Not yet." As the ship made its way back toward Earth, the remnants of their shattered world, humanity's story was far from over. There were still questions, still mysteries, and still dangers lurking out in the deep reaches of the universe. But Earth had proven something that day, that even in the face of incomprehensible odds, the spirit of mankind would endure. And whatever came next, they would meet it head-on. Together.